Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. Thank you so much for hanging in. I know it's getting towards the end of the day. Thank you for joining us for our discussion about manifesting the values of diversity and inclusion in our collections. I'm Michelle Baildon. I'm the collection strategist for arts and humanities at MIT Libraries. I'm joined by Becky Imamoto, who is the head of the Collection Strategies Department at UC Irvine, by Jenny Hudson, the Senior Collection Development Manager at GOBI Library Solutions, and Rachel Finn, the Social Sciences Librarian at Vassar College. And our time is short today, so we're just going to plunge right in right now. So back in 2016, 2017, I was involved in a task force at the MIT Libraries, the Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Justice Task Force of the Collections Directorate. And the central question of this task force was how we can operationalize the values of diversity, inclusion, and social justice in the daily work of our directorate. So we were asked to provide a set of practical recommendations along those lines, but we decided to take a conceptual approach, a sort of philosophical approach, and I'll describe a little bit like why we decided to do that. Despite this conceptual philosophical approach, we ended up having a pretty big practical impact on the organization at the grassroots, and a little bit of an impact across the profession as well, which you'll hear described by the other speakers. But as you can expect, when it comes to the issues of diversity, inclusion, social justice, many challenges remain in us actually achieving this vision. So the task force was charged by Greg Yao, the Associate Director for Collections. We convened from March to November of 2016. It's almost exactly 2 years to the day since we put out the first, the draft final report. The final report was released in February 2017, and you can find it in DSpace at MIT. There were 8 members that included both support and professional staff across archives and special collections, collection strategy, scholarly communication, technical services, and preservation. The group provided multiple opportunities for feedback for all members of the directorate to participate and offer their comments and thoughts on these issues by department visits, by anonymous submission form, by drop-in discussion sessions as well. So the title of our report is Creating a Social Justice Mindset, and the word mindset is a very important term. So in libraries, a lot of times we focus on process and productivity when we think about our work. But one of our major contentions was that ideas, emotions, human interactions are also an important part of the infrastructure of libraries. So changing mindsets is really key to achieve a vision of diversity, inclusion, and social justice. So it's been 2 years, and how's it gone? I'd say we've had a major impact, but I'd say a partial success, although there have been a lot of wins. So I'm not going to stay too long on this slide because time is short, but the definitions are actually one of the really essential aspects of this report. The key thing to remember is that the 3 definitions need to be considered together, and the social justice definition really is the linchpin of this report. So the key thing is that when we talk about diversity, we are talking about correcting systemic power imbalances. So it's not just about a diversity of perspectives, a diversity of backgrounds. It is about recognizing the reality of systemic power imbalances. So here's a diagram of the conceptual framework of our report. And again, I'm not going to spend too long on this, and the slides will be available, of course, later on. Happy to go back to discuss this in more detail later. The basic summary of this is that we have on the right side different structures of power. So the economic systems, neoliberalism, the commercialization of scholarly publishing, the corporatization of academic libraries, systems of social and political privilege and oppression. So this is going to include racism, white supremacy, misogyny, patriarchy, homophobia, heteronormativity, et cetera. On the left side, we have the values of libraries, which include, diversity, intellectual freedom, the public good, social responsibility, et cetera. And the basic intention of our report is that the core professional values of the profession of both librarianship and archives put us in opposition to the social forces, the economic forces that we assume to be existing and structuring our work. Based on this assumption, there are clear implications for how we react to these forces, the way that these power structures are expressed in our work in higher education and in publishing. Acting on behalf of our values suggests how we should respond, and we need to work together to create wider change. And here, values from ALA and from SAA. So a key impact of this report, of the work of the task force, has been thought leadership in our organization. So in our organization, and to some extent outside the organization and in the profession as well. So why this conceptual focus? Like, our idea was that providing clarity providing intellectual clarity or philosophical clarity gives the report more staying power than only confining ourselves to a list of specific recommendations. So the idea was to have a lasting impact by trying to shape the mindset. And we can attest that this is really, really difficult. So we were a little bit ahead of the game in the Collections Directorate, putting this report out 2 years ago. About 1 year ago, the MIT Libraries developed a new values and mission statement that does include the word social justice in it, so that brought it up to the organization level. And just a couple months ago, at the end of August, the MIT Library started a year-long engagement with Dieta Jones Associates. I don't know if folks out here know Dieta, she's wonderful. Dieta Jones Associates is doing a 1-year engagement with the MIT Libraries called Managing for Learning and Inclusion. And part of that program is something called the Equity Toolkit. It's a series of online courses about equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. So the report that we did was a real bottom-up attempt to change the mindset, to provide thought leadership. And I'll talk a little bit about the successes, but I think what we have found is that the really clear top-down or organization-wide leadership is pretty essential instead to make this a reality. Yeah, it's understandable, I think, that some colleagues have some unease or discomfort with these new concepts, that diversity, inclusion, and social justice should, have to be central to our work. And we've found some colleagues not reacting well, maybe having some anxiety about this change. And so the clear organization-wide mandate, the training, I think having the training from external experts who are well-versed in this area has been really key. So some of the practical impacts, inspiring and empowering our staff. So you can see on the left an example, the music library did a social justice LibGuide. This was something that they did spontaneously, actually before our report was even finished. Folks kind of got the idea, ooh, there's this big task force producing this big report. I guess social justice is where it's at. Let's jump on this bandwagon. So we were able to foster some interesting activity just that way. Since then, just a few practical examples. Acquisitions has started to use more local and independent vendors. We still do use Amazon, but have tried to dial that back. A really major impact has been the DISJ, what we call diversity, inclusion, social justice, the discussions in the 3 communities of practice, the subject-based communities of practice, which is how we organize our liaisons and selectors. So all 3 had multiple discussions, philosophical discussions about wrestling with these ideas, diversity, inclusion, social justice, talked about practical ways that we can possibly implement. Social sciences and management have already updated their collection development policies. My community of practice, arts and humanities, we will be working on it later this year and in the spring. And science and engineering is probably the trickiest one, and the direction they've taken it so far is to look at small publishers. And there is some interest, too, in thinking about publications coming out of the Global South. Oh, and actually just to say that I think one of the major impacts of us just writing this report, providing the definitions, and starting these conversations has been, it's a struggle to bring people on board to these values for who, maybe it's new, maybe it's a little bit of a struggle. The really clear success has been liberating people who are already on board or who are pretty close to being on board to be able to speak freely, and that these discussions are in fact legitimate and in fact necessary to the work that we do every day. So a couple more specific examples from the collection side, impact on monograph collections. So trying to zip through pretty quickly. So the Roach Library for Architecture and Urban Planning, we did a storage project earlier this year in the spring semester. We were inspired by our director, Chris Berg's talk from Timberline Institute 5 years ago and a blog post called Beyond Measure. And one of the basic arguments of that blog post is that making collections decisions, including patron-driven acquisitions, storage decisions based solely on metrics, can amount to doing collection development as a popularity contest. And by definition, marginalized perspectives will not be represented if we rely solely on quantitative measures. So in the Humanities Library a couple years ago, we tried to do a storage project in a principles-based way, found it to be extremely time-consuming, taking this very curatorial approach. So the first floor of the library was turned into a GIS lab that opened in the past couple months. And to make room for that, we had to store 17.5 thousand books. So how did we do that? We tried to use a hybrid quantitative plus principles-based approach. We found 8,000 books using just low-hanging fruit. So e-dupes, duplicate copies, monographic series, books that we consider to be questionable or sort of low-level publishers. That got us to 8,000. To find the other 9,000, we did a pull list of about 25K. We started out by narrowing it according to various criteria, so quantitative criteria, so bought before 2002, published between 1851 and 1990, assuming that older scholarship is likely to be a little bit out of step with our DISJ values. Excluded items published in the last 5 years. We then had a cataloger do a rough approximation of subject headings matching them to LC class. And the two selectors who did the storage project were then able to filter using these various criteria and the subject headings to take that principles-based approach in a more efficient way. I would say, though, that the success of this approach depended on the sophisticated understanding of those two selectors of DISJ issues. So in a sense, we already had selectors who had the DISJ mindset. Folks who are newer to this way of thinking, I think will require a little bit closer guidance and discussion if we do a project like this again in the future. And we will hear more details from Jenny in a couple minutes about a project we undertook with GOBI. So this is something we started working on last fall. It hasn't been fully implemented yet. Our wonderful rep, Laura Zisman, is about to come back from maternity leave, so I think we'll be able to go full steam ahead with this pretty soon. So the basic idea was to use the GOBI infrastructure to help us build inclusive collections more efficiently and reliably. So this was to help us build more inclusive collections. But our thinking was, can we possibly collaborate with GOBI to explore how we can propose changes that will affect systemic change across the entire customer base by adding new elements to the profiling infrastructure. So about a year ago, I got special funding for a Simmons SLIS student. We looked at factors including publishers, awards, monographic series, and review sources that suggest that the material might be DISJ relevant, if that makes sense. So a couple of the quick successes that we got were getting the Women's Review of Books and World Literature Today added as review sources to GOBI. So in other words, you can automatically get everything reviewed in Women's Review of Books sent to your library. And another thing we've been working on, I don't think this has been realized yet, with Alana Kumbier from Hampshire College working on a definition for disability studies as an interdisciplinary descriptor. So now I'm going to turn it over to Becky.
Hi, everyone. So how I come into play here is I read the MIT report and said, hey, this is fascinating. Maybe we could do something at UC Irvine based on this. And I took it to the Research Resources Division, which I'm a member of, to try to see if there was interest. And they said, that's great. We're not going to do anything like that right now. We're getting ready to implement ALMA. We've got a lot of other things going on. So I thought then, well, what can I do just in the collections department on my own without having to have other support? And I sent out an email to the subject librarians and said, hey, who's interested in this topic? Do you guys want to just get together informally and talk about like how we could assess our current collections for diversity, see where we might have gaps, and then also work on promoting them to our campus. And I think about 6 librarians said, that sounds good. So we kind of started a group, no charge, no reporting lines, nothing specific, just let's talk this through and come up with some ideas. And these are the things that we have worked on since then. So the first thing was kind of just getting a handle on who our students are. Of course, we know how many majors we have, what departments they're in, but where are they coming from? What's their background? We were able to, access data from, I'm sure you guys all have similarly sounding places on campus, Office of Institutional Research, Office of Inclusive Excellence, Office of Equal Opportunity and Diversity, to find out that, we are Hispanic as well as an Asian American, it's a really long acronym, Pacific Islander serving institutions. We have had a 100% increase in our international students in the last few years and a 24% increase in our first generation students. So with that information, we kind of talked about, well, what are we doing specifically for them? Have we reached out to them? Are we buying books that are not introduction to anthropology types of things? And we have a very in-depth allocation fund that you guys might have something similar, how many students, how many faculty, how many degrees, that's how much money you get, percentage kind of thing. So it doesn't really allow a lot of room for growth in some areas that might not be in a traditional subject. So we allocated a formula and gave some more money to the New Books Lobby, which is browsing new collection that we have. It's non-subject, non-format specific. And these are some of the books that I've been able to purchase with that. And I do really pay attention to, I'm sorry I wrote blank studies, but Jenny might be able to rattle them all off her head. Asian American studies, Chicano Latino studies, LGBT studies. When I see those in GOBI, I make sure to take a close look at them to see if I can buy them and make sure they're out there for people to see. And with that, we also created a diverse book display in our lobby. It's called Off the Shelf. Oh, shoot, no, I can't even remember what it's called. Maybe it'll show it on another slide. And this has been really interesting. Not only, we opened it up to librarians if they had an idea of something that they wanted to do to display, but we've also opened it up to student groups and to classes. Like if a professor has a class that they want to work on something, they can. So, so far, let's see. We've had Black Lives Matter. We had one on hunger and homeless for the Hunger and Homeless Awareness Week. Feminist Illuminati was our first school club group, and this is part of their display that they put together. They were really into it. They asked if they could have media, they wanted to have screens showing things. We're like, that's great. We love your enthusiasm. We can't do that right now. Diversity at the Olympics. We try to sometimes do it around, like that happened during the Winter Olympics in February 2018. Diverse People Unite was about South Africa's post-apartheid. A Chicano Latino class did one called Chicano Latinos and Labor. And then last Friday, we actually had this new one put up by Drama 129 called Performing Whiteness. I'm not quite sure what it's about, but it's something about that topic in drama and theater. So you can see the students are all there with the books they've picked. And then, Off the Shelf and On Display. Sorry, that's what it's called. With that, there's blog posts. So if a class wants to do it and the teacher wants to make them have a writing assignment, they can write about the different books or what's happening behind it. So these are just some images from that. And then moving over to talking about GOBI, which Jenny will also touch on, so I'm going to go through these quickly due to time, is we've also been paying much more attention to the award notice in GOBI, sending this out. This is a screenshot that I sent to the subject librarians with a list again of reminding them of the different book awards, the diverse ones, and seeing what we had and what we didn't have. GOBI has also been really helpful in just generating some complex reports for us. One of the members on the informal group is our Chicano Latino Studies librarian, and she was really wanting to make sure we had more Latin American film and drama titles. They have a very important film festival that they do every year, and she felt that it just wasn't, it probably was, our collection wasn't as great as it could be. So I sat down with her and with GOBI, and we came up with lots of different parameters and searches we could run, and looked at content level, literary type, aspects, geographic specifications, all that stuff. And we got a list of 957 titles, of which we had purchased 293, and it says that clearly on the list from GOBI. So it left us with 664 titles for that subject librarian to go through and review. She was checking them to see if they were already in the UC system, but was certainly making some purchases based on that. Our drama librarian was interested in looking at LGBTQ plays. As you probably know, the subject headings for plays in all literature might not be as specific in some areas. So how we went about doing this is there is this book called For the Gay Stage, A Guide to 456 Plays. And we went through it. We had already owned 193, which is 42%. And it has pretty high circulation for those titles. We were happy with that. But we also then looked like those ones that we had. 80 of them had no subject headings whatsoever, but 50 did have specifically LGBTQ subject headings. And you can just see an image over there from White Plains. I know it's probably hard to see in the back, but that's one where it does not have specifically LGBTQ subject headings. So the other outcome from this project was we discovered, or our drama librarian, I should say, discovered new publishers that he wanted to pay attention to. He did purchase 40 of the plays that we didn't have, and we are considering doing some enhancing future cataloging projects with this. Our cataloging people are really involved with Alma right now. But along with that, since we do have Alma and Primo now, we have tagging. So we're testing it out. Anyone can tag, but we do have the plays tagged. If someone comes across it, that was part of that. The other class too that was performing whiteness has helped work on this. And then I was just thinking about the age of our print collection, and this is something that I was looking at ethnic studies, the sexuality section in women's studies, and I used history, Great Britain as kind of a test case. This is an example of seeing how they looked at it, because I wanted to make sure that our print collection was updated, that we didn't just have stuff from the 60s or 70s in there, that we were still collecting in these areas. And this was pretty easy. This is one of those projects where we already had the information buried in some report that people do every year anyway, just had to go and find it and take a look at it. And I'm sorry if you can't quite see this in the back, but it does show it over the different time periods. The brown is the one that's the most recent, and I am not surprised that it's down. First of all, we don't have a full decade when the other ones are decades, but also it's the print collection and doesn't show ebooks. My timer is already going off. So if anyone knows how, I'd love to get the ebook data in there. I have to figure that out as well. But I'm still not, this was helpful to me, and I think it shows that we are still actively collecting in these areas. Of course, maybe not as much as we did when we had higher budgets, like in the earlier 2000s, but it's still a growing collection. And then finally, I will wrap up with, I thought I would look at interlibrary loan data. If you guys were at an earlier presentation, someone had asked a question about looking at interlibrary loan data for diversity too. I did this. I thought this is going to be really interesting to see what kind of results I get. So I pulled all from 2017. Our system that we have doesn't include subject headings or call numbers, I think. So I actually used the GOBI interface to do an ISBN search. I don't know if it was equipped to do it that way. I had to break it down into sizable chunks because you couldn't do more than 1,000 or something at a time. It did come up with ones that don't match, the foreign language things, but I was left with over 7,000 titles. And I did go through, with help from the rest of the people in this group, and added just the first listed subject heading. What I learned was this wasn't the best thing, probably not the best use of time. I wanted to share that with you guys because I think always good on presentations to hear what didn't work as well. It was very time intensive, and there's just way too many subject headings out there to find, or for me to be able to find a pattern to say, here's what we're really missing things in that people want. And I don't know if this is the case with you guys, but at UC Irvine, I think we were kind of trying to reach the undergraduate population. Undergraduates aren't a huge user of interlibrary loan. It's mostly faculty and graduate students that know what they want. But I did see, there's a list here of the ones that were requested quite a lot for different books. And I'll just end with showing a very boring slide, but this is kind of part of the spreadsheet. And if you look at the far right column with the subject heading, you'll even see in the area of sex, there's just so many different variations that start with sex that it's not giving me as great of amount of data. It was interesting for other reasons. I found out like where a lot of print books are requested where we might have had the electronic, but in terms of a diversity, I didn't learn a ton. So I am going to turn it over to Jenny now.
Hi, I'm going to try to be kind of quick because I want Rachel to speak too. I work with GOBI Library Solutions from EBSCO, also known or previously known as YBP Library Services or Yankee Book Peddler. So if you've been hearing them mention GOBI and you didn't know who we were, that's who we are. We're based in Contoocook, New Hampshire, and we are a third-party vendor that works between the publishers, the ebooks, and the libraries, and we really work on workflow solutions, helping libraries identify materials. So just in case anyone out there doesn't know who we are and what our job is in this, we have been working with libraries lately, and we've heard a lot more about this diversity conversation. So one of the key points of what we do on a day-to-day basis is we take and ingest every book that we have, and it sits down with a human being, whether it's an ebook or a print book, and we process it through a book-in-hand processing model. But basically what that does is it lets us put basic bibliographic information, but then identify other information pieces that could be key for something like these projects that these people are working on. And those can be interdisciplinary aspect, geographic focus, format, etc. But in the cases of these sorts of projects, it's usually those three things that are the key piece to it. So we basically have approached this with two different ways. One is evaluating the collection. So something kind of like what Becky has said, where we are actually taking their past purchase history. In the case of Irvine, we're their primary English language vendor, and we also take in their holdings. So we had a really good history of the material that they have bought over a long period of time. So when she approached me about some of these diversity analysis projects, we were able to take that and using all of those tags that I mentioned from our history of adding these to the library's bibliographic information, we were able to then come up with these reports that could identify all the material that might have to do with, in the case of Latin American film, had a geographic focus of some country or region of Latin America and was also tagged with an aspect of film. So that's how it all works, how it's all coming together and working with them. We've done this for quite a few libraries now, and the benefit is it gives the library that ability to go back and say, what do we need to do as a backfill? But in a way, it also helps teach us what we can do better to have better profiles, to better represent a more inclusive, more diverse offering. The second piece is, with what we were just talking about with this is sort of looking backwards and talking about how have we worked in the past. On top of that, it doesn't behoove anyone if all you do is say, okay, we're going to backfill and call that good. The idea is that if it's really important to the university, to the library, that what we need to do is also make sure that there's an ongoing presence, there's an ongoing solution in place. And so part of these projects is also identifying how we can make sure that from here on forward, we are at least notifying the library of materials, and in a lot of cases, putting in place a solution where those materials will auto ship and be sort of mindless. They don't have to think about it. They don't have to go through committees trying to build these projects. So what we need to do in doing that, we just look at the library's core needs. And then we sort of work within their collection development policies and their budgets, because budgets are always a key to this, but make sure there's a solution, an ongoing solution. Again, using those same tags, that same identifiers that we put in place, but making sure that moving forward, they are there and then, as I always say, we have to track and tweak them as time passes, because everybody changes their philosophies, their priorities, and there is no perfect solution always. So we're always constantly working with the libraries to make sure that we're meeting the needs and tracking this over a long period of time. An example I had for this was the University of Washington of Tacoma. They had a really strong interest in Pacific Northwest Native American cultures, and they really they gave us a list of tribes, of regions, of areas of interest, and we were able to build a very honed in, strong collection focus based on those very specific things they were looking for. So, this is my last slide. I'm trying to be real fast. What Michelle and Becky have both said is that one of the things that we've been trying to do really hard and really strongly is listen to the libraries. I've mentioned we are based in New Hampshire in a small town. I think that it's very important for us to try to think outside of a New Hampshire box and outside of a regional box. So that's one of the things we've been working really hard on, is trying to listen to the libraries globally, locally, and what they're saying. And that has really actually resulted in some really great things. Michelle had said disability studies, that's actually in the works. We're actually looking at something as well that we're calling poverty studies. I'm not sure what that's going to look like right now, but we are in the definition period of that. Michelle had mentioned encouraging awards and reviews. I'm excited to say that just because of that and this sort of focus on this, we added 40 new awards this year that were based in this sort of an area of interest. She's also mentioned the Women's Review of Books and World Literature Today, and we're not stopping there. I think this is very important to us. I'm on a task force internally that's sort of working to make this useful for all of you. And then one thing I do want to note is that, it's because of libraries that we have made tweaks to the profiles to be more culturally sensitive. So we now have Indigenous studies instead of Native American studies. It's not just gay and lesbian studies, it's LGBTQ, and we are growing. Social justice is one that we're working on right now, and how are we going to grow and incorporate that. And then publishers and partners, I am hearing every day, we are hearing everybody wants the smaller, the more unique, and so we're trying to accomplish all of that. So that's really where we are listening to all of you, and I would suggest if any of you work with GOBI and you have some suggestions, we want to hear you. We're welcome to we would love to help you, but we also want to hear it from you guys. So I'm going to pass this over to Rachel because she has a little bit less than 10 minutes.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Rachel Finn, and I am. Let me make sure I have this. Wait. Just right here. No. Okay. So I'm a social sciences librarian from Vassar College. I'm a social sciences librarian, a liaison librarian. And so I'm also a former teacher, a high school teacher, which is something that I feel significant to mention as I sort of incorporate that into what I try to do as I work with students at Vassar, which is an undergraduate institution. In addition to providing reference support for departments, I also teach, and I'm responsible for collection development and management in my subject liaison areas, which are Africana studies, anthropology, economics, political science, sociology, and urban studies. I'm not an expert in critical studies, so I want to stress that, and I'm not an expert in collection development practices. I'm just someone who believes in and takes very seriously the immense power that librarians and archivists wield in the way that they develop those collections and make information available to our patrons, to our user populations, wherever they may be, whether academic libraries, public libraries. So I want to kind of take it back to something that Michelle was talking about. This is more, I guess this presentation is more of a practical, me coming into this position as like my first full-time position as a reference librarian who is primarily trained in archives and special collections and coming in to work as a liaison librarian and reference librarian. So I just want to preface it with that as well. But I also want to, as I said, take it back to something Michelle was talking about, which is the initiatives initiated by MIT. Those are some things that we also took on at Vassar. Myself and a former colleague, Heidi Bertu, who is no longer at Vassar College. She was the head of technical services. She was inspired by some things that happened in the library to look into and create a diversity, inclusion, and social justice working group. She asked me to co-chair. Since she left, I'm the chair of the committee, and this group was created in the fall of 2017, inspired again by MIT, and that report, Creating a Social Justice Mindset. In response, we met. We had 6 people from different. So we had librarians, we had a couple of managers in the group, and we had some library support staff in the group as well. And what we did was meet. We met a few times, and we came up with three important points. And I keep forgetting to do my slides. We came up with 3 important points that really were sort of built on some of the things that, some of these quotes that you're going to see in these slides. We really were thinking about how not only the work that we do in technical services and the work that we do in building collections and things like that, and how what we do sort of how we have to be very conscious of what we're doing, but we also wanted to sort of incorporate that into the everyday work of what we do in the library to kind of like flip a switch so that we didn't look at, I guess, that social justice mindset as something that's actually separate from the work that we do to build collections, to work with students, and so forth. So that we begin to think of them as like just one thing. Like we're not doing anything special by creating diverse collections, inclusive collections, or incorporating social justice, but we just do it because that's what you should be doing, basically. So again, from the Code of Ethics of the American Library Association, something really, I think, really important, we're trying to support and we're trying to nurture this informed citizenry in the work that we do, particularly at colleges and universities, schools, and so forth. And so we want to keep these things in mind. Again, so we've heard so much about people talking about neutrality in libraries, and this is so important, I think, in everything, in the projects that you've heard here, in the work that we do here, in the work that, in the thinking, I guess, and sort of these practical applications that I myself have tried to put into place. It's just kind of important to kind of think about that idea of neutrality, and that whether or not we should be separating our perspectives from the work that we do to build and shape collections. And I personally don't think that we should, particularly when we are talking about fostering that mindset. But I do recognize, I don't necessarily understand, but I recognize that sometimes, as Michelle said, that can be sort of an uncomfortable process for some people. People don't know where to start. Again, I can't speak to why that would be the case, but I know that it's a reality. So when I came to the work that I was doing, again, first full-time librarian position, first full-time position where I have fairly significant collection development duties, I thought about, and working with colleagues at my library and in other libraries, talking about these issues with all types of people, what I realized is like, okay, much like so many other things in our life, we really have to kind of think about what comes first. We have to evaluate where we are and what shapes how we proceed with the work that we do. So first, again, we have to recognize this painful truth. The profession is predominantly middle class, it's predominantly white, predominantly privileged. Whether you're white or middle class, most of us who are librarians have a measure of privilege. Well, all of us who are librarians, whether white or not, have a measure of privilege just by virtue of being in this profession. So we're not neutral, and that we also, along with archivists, our brethren, cisgen, if you're Jamaican, they also, we all perpetuate inequality and help maintain power structures with the work that we do, often unconsciously. Unfortunately, some of us may do it consciously. I hope not, but some of us might. So we do want to keep that in mind. So I want to think, and I'm trying to speed it up because I'm at 7 minutes. Okay, so I think that the first thing that we have to do is think about, and this is what I did when I was at work, because I was like, okay, how do I navigate this? And I had these experiences where I worked that sort of made me think more about, you know, how people approach this and why it was such a difficult process to I guess, broaden collections, make them more inclusive, why it was also such a difficult process for this to be sort of a, just this automatic thing that we do when we do collection work. So instead of, again, recalling any specific experiences, I just want to offer some observations and suggestions. So how do we get there from here? After we reckon with those hard truths, I guess we probably need to reckon with them a little more. And some of you may have read work by Nina de Jesus, particularly that essay on In the Library with the Lead Pipe. She says, when we look into collections, the actual information contained in libraries and how it's organized, we can see that it, surely by accident, of course by accident, somehow manages to construct a reality wherein whiteness is default, normal, civilized, and everything else is other. So whiteness and other forms of privilege, of course. We also think about, you know, we need to think about like how our social situations, who we are, where we come from, inform what we do. And so thinking about social situations and how they enable and set limits on what we can know, and how we have to actually critically examine those notions that we hold so dear, or that maybe we don't even realize we hold dear. So I want to talk about collection development, how I began to think about it and like apply these things like as I was sort of flying blind and myself personally, thinking about how we need to do this. So like first, in the work with the DISJ committee, began to think about how we can use ethical acquisitions principles and what those consist of. And in reality, they consist of many of the things that both Michelle and Becky have talked about. You know, being conscious of those the publishers, the monographic series, the review series, and you know, awards that are awarded to these particular publications or these authors. We need to research alternate vendors. We need to be honest about knowledge gaps and not be personally offended that there may be knowledge gaps or that there may be things that we just weren't aware of, and to educate ourselves and to take pains to do that. We all start somewhere with like the knowledge, with I guess filling those knowledge gaps. You know, we can do this by following librarians on Twitter, following scholars, historians, reading, looking at those different reviews and so forth. And those are some of the things that I really did and really helped me to be able to build, to feel like fairly confident in my ability to hit all of the areas that I think I need to in the work that I do. Because for instance, economics is one of my my departments, and I really know nothing about economics, like honestly, but I taught myself about economics and I began to think about like, what are the issues within that field that I need to be including that are going to be useful to the students who are trying to prepare to go out into the world as, you know, to work in whatever capacity or on to graduate school, and to be thinking with that social justice mindset. And I think we also really need to develop bias consciousness, and that's whether you're a white male or black female, or whether you're straight, whether you're part of the LGBTQ community. We need to do those things so that as we go through and we begin to really put these things into practice, we're ready to actually be very open about what we choose. So I'm going to speed through. I'm speeding. Okay, so again, I want to go, so what I did and what Heidi and I actually talked about was like this 5-point approach to figuring out what should be purchased and what we would want to evaluate in a catalog, what we want to look at to evaluate the needs for our library. So first, to assess the collections, kind of do all of those things that we heard from Becky, employ them in some form or fashion. If we're able to do them in as great a depth as Becky and also Michelle, that's wonderful. But if not, just kind of like, take a look at those collections. What do we have? What are we buying? Are we going to have meetings so that we kind of share where we're at with those things maybe on a like departmental meeting scale each week or every couple of weeks? We're going to evaluate the curricular needs for academic libraries and also the user populations for academic or public libraries. So we want to identify and accept that gaps exist. It's okay that gaps exist. What's not okay is if we don't fill them. So we prioritize inclusive collections by developing subject area expertise. And that can be hard. It's great if maybe you have the support of your institution where you could take a class or two, but we can do that on our own by reading, by exploring, by doing the things that as librarians we tell our students to do. And then immerse yourself in the subject. It's not always easy, it takes time, but we got to do that so that we can actually do what we need to do to develop those collections and make them more inclusive. Move away, I personally think moving away from approval plans as primary collection development tools. It's really great, and I think more and more like we have to, because libraries just don't have those big budgets where they can just say, hey, we're going to take everything from this place, from this university publisher. We're just going to do everything from this. I mean, sometimes we can, and those are some of the things that we mentioned. That's great if we're able to do that. But I think combining this sort of mindset that we want to develop in ourselves with those approval plans is really like a really great way to sort of be really inclusive and feel really strong about like how you approach and evaluate the work that you do in collection building. So again, those practical steps. So a couple of things, so please ignore, these are my last 2 slides. Please ignore my sad and sorrowful little attempts at charts or whatever you would call this. But okay, so one of the things in the discussions with departments that I found with my departments and then with other people who are working on things, and much like myself who don't like really have a super, like if I use economics again as an example, it's like, how do you do this? So if we're looking at, for instance, African American women or whatever, take whatever topic you want, and we're thinking about how we develop in our liaison areas, right, or in our subject areas, we would, look at our subject areas. So if we're thinking about art history, when we want to diversify a collection, make it more inclusive, instead of just broadly going in and maybe buying a bunch of stuff about Black women, about Latinx women or, groups, about LGBTQ, we want to think about, okay, so we're thinking about sciences, psychology, chemistry. We want to think about like African American women in psychology. What did they do? What issues affect them? How do we, what have African American women scholars contributed to the field? And those are the things that we want to pull in. And I think that seems very simplistic, but I think I learned from talking to people that it really like escapes, oh, this is how we actually diversify. It's not that we get all the books that have, Native Americans on the cover, but rather that we think about the issues that affect the topics, the people who contribute, the important people in the field, and then we buy on that, okay? So we do that in art history, so across, fields, sciences, history, sociology. We're doing the same thing, African American women in these fields. And I'm speeding through, I'm kind of cutting out, but sorry, I know I'm over, I'm going. Okay, and so the next thing that I think about is like collecting almost on a spiral, and this is again a sad and sorrowful image, but bear with me. What I started to think about was like, okay, if I'm developing on African American women in the United States, I kind of center that topic, right? And then, rather than thinking about them in a particular field, thinking more about like the issues that affect them. So, when I looked at my collection when I got there, was there anything, or were there things about Black female archetypes, Black women in poverty, womanism, cultural significance of hair or beauty? Ooh, it's kind of big. Black American, where's my, oops, sorry. Oops, and oops again, there we go. Okay, Black women during, slavery or the civil rights movement, Black women in poverty. So then I began to think about like how, for me, like this is my area of expertise. So like I can hit all of these things, but I did this with economics. So when I think about, economics and inequality or various, marginalized groups, I put those kind of like along this spiral for myself, and sometimes I even drew it out on a paper and thought, okay, do I have books on all of these things? I want to be looking for books on these things. I want to look at subject headings in these areas and kind of connect that with economics, for instance. If the topic is, African American history, we want to do the same thing, or women's studies, we want to do the same things. And this is one of the things that has been really helpful to me in really teaching myself how to, not miss those things that maybe I might miss, even though these are areas of, high interest and expertise for me. So with that, I guess I'm gonna wrap this up because I know we want to take some questions. But yeah, these are just a couple of ways I thought about, approaching collection development, and really thought about like the fact that we all need to examine where we're at, our biases, what we bring to the table, so that we can do the best possible job to make these collections more inclusive. Thank you so much, and I'm so sorry to have gone over.
We know we're over. It's okay. We need to leave, but if you have questions, you want to come up and talk to us after, or no, it's fine. We're still here.